Hello everyone, today we talk about the 10th and 11th century Reconquista, focusing on certain specific topics and characters, also Al-Mansur and El Cid de Campeador among the others. So really giving these bits of of context, of perspectives, etc. And I think it's interesting because recently we discussed on the Crusade playlist the origins of the Crusades, the ideological roots, if you want, and this context is particularly important and overlooked because many people assume that fundamentally the Crusades started in 1095, point, end of the discussion, and then it was all about fundamentally the Near East and so on. But definitely this Iberian scenario is pretty important, as much as, for example, the Baltic one will be. But this Mediterranean perspective often gets, in fact, in second, like in bit of in the background, right? As if this was fundamentally just a kind of an Iberian story. Instead, we see that this idea that the entire Christianity had to join the struggle to recover Christian lands and expand, in this sense, the Christian world, also in a kind of sense of reconquest proper. That's what the Reconquista fundamentally is this idea that, once certain lands were Christians, the Muslims came, they conquered them, and now they have to struggle back to take them back. And this is particularly important because in medieval Iberian history, you find essentially the strongest sense of all, right? The Crusades, the canonic Crusades that we remember, like in the Near East, they at the beginning they were kind of successful, then eventually the Ottoman states go lost, so the West gets a bit, relativistic about it, like saying, okay, well, yeah, we've lost it, it's not a big deal, let's forget in part. That's how they started to deal with the Muslims diplomatically. So we've made several videos in the sense of this transformation, and also talking not much about the crusade in itself, but also how it was perceived and it transformed, like, politically speaking, right? Also the Baltic Crusades basically are fought against, I can't say an invisible enemy, but obviously paganism was substantially not capable to, it was not at the same level of Christianity in terms of posing a threat or an alternative view of the world at that point, while Islam was, right? So especially for defining the Iberian identity, this long medieval Reconquista is a big defining moment in the building of more than just, this Christian kingdoms that eventually come to occupy the peninsula, but something deeper, like this sense of belonging and kind of proto-national, even national sense, based on this struggle that the Reconquista had been. Obviously, with all the the debatable perceptions and ideological constructions that, as you know, what we know is mostly the perspective of the elites that naturally were to legitimize their expansion on the base of this religious struggle, and then the reality, especially in say at the bottom, was somewhat more blurred at the end of the day. We will see now, but it's pretty unknown to anyone who has even a simple knowledge about the Reconquista, etc., that it was a much more progressive and like Christians and Muslims also fought against each other all the time. There were lots of, but there is also this greater trend at the end of the day on the longer perspective that objectively brings the Christians to progressively expand far south and to eventually take over Muslim Iberia, right? So starting in this centuries, from these early centuries, during the 10th, in the northern Iberian Peninsula, there were essentially two main entities that were the Kingdom of the Asturias, eventually known as the Kingdom of Leon, right, and the one of Navarre as well, that were, as you know, created after this major collapse of Christian Spain, in the 8th century, and these were all these kingdoms far in the north, also in certain particular environmental contexts that kind of resisted against this Islamic tide that in fact came sometimes even to to push very to threaten their own existence. So, but they were shaping now. They were managing to reorganize and to coordinate always in a better way their own forces, and to prepare eventually to this counterattack that would have occurred the roughly 2 centuries afterwards, the Arab Berber conquest, the beginning of the revenge, right? This was important, right? Even these kingdoms weren't quite founded like the greatest gluing factor was religion proper, right? These powers, especially the kingdom of the Asturias, was theoretically, it had other legacies that had been, in fact, the Visigothic kingdom with all its traditions, even its particular ecclesiastical right, its own even imperialistic ambitions in some fashion that kind of shipwrecked because of eventually the loss of power of the monarchy and the expansion of power of oligarchs, etc. But that, in fact, at this point had kind of abandoned that perspective. And here we should open a bit this digression in the sense that, of course, there were certain legacies that were maintained within these kingdoms from the Visigothic heritage and so on. There is actually a lot from that too, but also because these regions of the north had objectively been, also changed certain, at an ethnical level, for example. It was a strong presence. These were regions that were ancient, kind of more Celtic, for example, than Iberian, right? The more you go to the north, then there were these other populations of Germanic origin that had come. So, naturally, the Iberian Peninsula was very composite, and even locally speaking, that there were kind of lot of differences, even a short, distance. So there's not this, so compact, identifiable character that you can attribute. But let's say that at this point, against the common enemy, that appeared as overwhelming, but because objectively the Umayyad Caliphate, the Caliphate of Cordoba, was one of the greatest powers in European West at this point. Well, all that mattered was really the struggle, right, in the name of the cross, in the name of the Roman religion. And part of the local liturgy had, let's say, gone exchanged for pragmatic reasons with the Roman one proper, because essentially when the Muslims invaded Spain very quickly, very rapidly, very brutally, these powers found themselves like hanging on this northern mountains of Iberia, saying, we're done with. So they tried to get any form of help from anyone, and the Pope offered to help them by making this exchange of the essentially of the Visigothic rite with the Roman one, by saying, okay, from now on you don't act anymore like a church who thinks to be something on its own, because objectively what the Visigothic church had developed into that direction in open competition even with Rome. You accept the Roman one, and so this brought, in fact, there were lots of refugees from Christian Iberia that had also fled to Italy, to Francia. There was this idea that also from the other side, the matter had been felt, the matter had been understood, and objectively these Christian powers in the north remained a thorn on the side to the Umayyad power, right? The Umayyad power was based and solidly concentrated mostly in the south. That was naturally the richest and more developed and cultured and area in the whole peninsula, right? So these Christians were dwelling in the opposite side, right, of the peninsula, and there was also a middle ground in this sense, where the Reconquista and this kind of perennial frontier warfare started developing, right? That also caused several changes at a local level. For example, even in developing a certain type of economy, was constant warfare on this frontier, when you realize that also at this point the religious identities were pretty mixed. Like there were Christians, were Muslims from kind of all sides in certain areas, and there were these smaller powers that were trying between one larger entity and another, even to carve their own space. Today we'll essentially witness the end of the Umayyad Caliphate, the fragmentation into the famous Taifas. So that is also what partly triggered the Reconquista proper, because as long as the Umayyad Empire, or the Umayyad Caliphate, excuse me, was standing, was one thing. It's not that the Christians had much of an option. The Umayyads also launched periodical raids into the north, trying to stem and to subdue, at least formally, these powers. The first wave was the toughest one, for which theoretically almost basically all the peninsula was at least nominally subdued. But obviously from the top of this mount, it's very tough, extremely tough ground. Ask anyone who has fought in Spain, like the Romans or Napoleon. It's Spain, I think, together with Italy, is like and the Balkans. Yeah, it's all about Southern Europe, basically. It's, tactically speaking, and strategically speaking as well, is pure nightmare, right? It's one of those territories that which it's extremely tough to even make a little step, right? It's a hell of a place. Like the Iberian plateaus are terrible grounds in the first place, and that's what also toughened up largely these communities that lived largely with war, right? War here is a macroscopical datum of the political and social development of these societies, more even than in the south, because in the south there were problems as well. Sometimes the Umayyads had trouble even to control some of the wealthiest cities in southern Spain, but more or less that there was this unity, right? That was also kind of more of even Roman, Byzantine, in fact, origin than else. That basically Byzantine Spain in the south fell like just shortly to the Visigoths, just shortly before the Islamic invasions. It was just a couple of decades, if I'm not wrong. So this is important. There are mines, there are many, there's a very fertile ground, and that's where you can in fact build up a real state like what the Umayyad one was, objectively, with a tax system, professional military, and this, in fact, strategical capabilities of launching raids all around. The Visigoths had different center of power, by the way, a bit shifted more to the center of the peninsula. So in this sense, even the survival, this Christian powers in the north was some sort of secured, at least at this point, right? So that's in a nutshell. So how is in this very slow turning of the tides that this long phase of Spanish history known as the Reconquista, that would last like half of a millennium up to the end of the 15th century, started, right? This is a very important passage, because in many ways you can see it like, you can measure the Reconquista from the actual expansion of northern, this Christian kingdoms in the north, but objectively had been even a continuous struggle from the fall, from the beginning of the 8th century to the end of the 15th, right? So we're talking about like almost 800 years, right? Just thinking how this world was shaped by that, right? And by the way, Spain at this point, especially Muslim Spain, was one of the most advanced. Like the Umayyad, the Caliphate was a call of culture, of education, of research. The same Christians went to search for for material there. It was it was the Umayyads were kind of unavoidable interlocutors with the greatest powers in Europe, like with the the Teutonian Empire. Excuse me. And I just was thinking about yesterday videos about the Ottomans, and so there was this idea of leadership that also was pretty strong, right? Always remember this was a caliphate, so theoretically, even if the Umayyads had lost all the caliphate in the east, right? Objectively, the Umayyad Caliphate was a massive thing. Was a pretty massive thing. So this makes you see even this clash between the Christians and the Muslims in Spain, like David versus Goliath in many ways. By the way, the Umayyads controlled also, let's say at least at a distance formally, certain large areas of northwestern Africa, up to Tunisia and down to far to Morocco. So this was a real center of power in many ways. So there is this very important figure who is Ibn Abi Amir Al-Mansur, also known as Al-Mansur in Christian sources, was the Grand Vizier, this minister, the Chamberlain of the Cordoban Caliph Hisham II, the Umayyad dynasty. He was born in Algeciras in 938 and died in Medinatelli in 1002. Seemingly he was of Arab descent proper, and he rose through the civil bureaucracy up to becoming, in fact, vizier of Hisham II. And having wiped out in the meanwhile all his competitors, and he basically transferred the administration of his own new residence close to Cordoba. He governed the Al-Andalus, as the Caliphate of Cordoba was called, as Vicar of the Caliph, right? So he was an alter ego of the caliphal rule, and managing in large ways to make even certain Christian lords in the northern frontier to pay tribute, and defeating them in a series of fortunate campaigns in the north of the Iberian Peninsula. All right, and Al-Mansur was a very clever politician, and he understood. He was perfectly aware that as long as the ensemble of the Muslim state in Spain would remain solid, remain steady, these rising pushes from the Christian north could have been contained, absorbed, right? So he basically passed on the offensive for this reason. He launched this harsh counteroffensive to various Christian raids that occurred, at this point, kind of regularly into Muslim territories and vice versa, right? This is important because, as we were saying before, in the north also the Umayyad rule was weaker, of course. So there were these local Muslim lords that fought this guerrilla frontier warfare, let's say, with Christians, kind of unequal grounds, right? When instead the Caliph moved, right? So when from Cordoba a proper army was sent, it was a really big expedition, and at that point, it's not that tactics or strategies would change a big deal up there, because it was at the end of the day still guerrilla, preferably also in the very tough ground that we described before, but it was a pretty heavy blow to absorb, right? It's very much the front, and this happened every once in a while, because in the 10th century you don't have so readily available all the resources that you want. Mounting up an expedition of those of that magnitude is an enormous effort, right? That only a state like the Cordoban one can afford. And therefore it's quite of a big deal. You have otherwise to think that this was like literally the far west in Europe, also in the far west of Europe objectively, and this cattle raiding, guerrilla warfare, etc., and cavalry, the development of the famous jinetes that you can find both in the Christian and the Muslim armies alike, that perfectly reflect the need of this light cavalries to operate hit and run tactics, scorched land strategy, and harassing the enemy and all this stuff. So this offensive was very important also because it was a way to reassert the Cordovan power in general, like showing essentially to the Christians that this caliphate was a real caliphate, was a really universal power, right, in many ways. So this idea of launching an offensive is not just a strictly military matter. Like, this is not an enemy like all the others. It's really the big enemy, the overwhelming enemy, the doom, right? The big thing that is overloaded also with all of these religious meanings of this clash between the two religions. So it's a way to prove also the might of your own power. It was naturally based on religions, as basically all powers were at this time, and proving in this sense the greatness of this power. And Al-Mansur, in fact, was very clever to use this mean, and as we've seen, that this very hard counteroffensive was made up of several even preparatory raids and invasions, etc. But it had a preventive character, right? And it culminated in the years 996 and 997, in the assault of the city of Compostella, right? That was sacked and damaged, albeit the relics of the Apostle James, Santiago, were kept still within that were kept in the great city sanctuary of Compostela, were not desecrated. This is very important because this was more than just an incursion, right, or an invasion on a large scale. By the way, consider here also the strategical point of the thing. It's not really about conquering those lands. It's about that was kind of out of the options, right? The Umayyad power at this point couldn't practically hope to subdue these powers with an army, and when this army would necessarily have to come back into the south, the north would simply obey and everything would remain. Obviously, it was like the strategical level was like launching all this tiring, like, was a way to wear out the enemy in many ways, to destroy it, to weaken it structurally, progressively. This raiding character, this destructive character, was particularly important because objectively for the economy of the time, like destroying entire farms and cultivations and cities, etc., was a way, to eventually wipe out even the possibility in several generations for these places to revive, right? So it was a big deal, but at the same time, it was no true chance in this age in general to think to occupy permanently an area, especially of a frontier area where there was not a big deal of even of urban development, etc. So where to base a proper center of control. The north was naturally much poorer than the south, so this was the eternal problem. Was like launching this series of shoulder push that would progressively weaken the enemy at the point over time to bring him to depend on you, if anything, economically speaking, or just through deterrence, etc. But it was otherwise impossible to maintain his land. So when you look at these expeditions, you say, well, they didn't quite manage to win. Well, yeah, but they already knew that. They were done for achieving that specific strategical thing. Yeah, I say this say this because many people say, oh well, they launch all of these expeditions, like it could be this example, but there are countless in here, everywhere, these repeated offensives, and we say, oh well, they failed all the time. It's a big failure. Well, it really wasn't, because at the end of the day, the only way to achieve some result was exactly that one. And in part they did, of course, because, this expeditions destroyed an awful lot of stuff. The problem was rather than a longer and kind of imperscrutable perspective to know how the broader relation of strengths would kind of evolve, right? And at that point, the greatest problem was the internal political unity, as we will see, in fact, with the Umayyads, that basically collapsed on themselves at one point, rather than hoping to positivistically, conquer everything, like as if it could be possible in the first place. Like it would seem possible to some of us who are not acquainted with these worlds, but in those worlds was perfectly fine, that everything was done in a very gradual way, and there was no way to directly occupy everything if there was not a solid base of power, like instead there had been in the south of Spain, right, with the Islamic invasions that in fact seized the most fertile and advanced and productive areas of Spain and settled there, and they formed a state, right? But the episode of Santiago de Compostella is particularly meaningful, because it had it showed from Al-Mansur's side a great intelligence and extraordinary comprehension, let's say, this symbolical value that the operation had, right? Although it had a side effect that we will see now in a while, that the Muslims didn't quite expect at the end of the day. Just a word, the Santiago de Compostela rose in around the 9th century, around the sepulchre of the Apostle James. This sepulchre had been built was built by the Bishop Theodomir, right? And several bishops was transferred even in here. It was a seat of councils that had taken place in 810, 862, 899. It was the favored city of King Sancho and by the King Bermuda II for their own crowning, right? It was becoming a very important century. It was in many ways in this fragmented Christian north, which was still fragmented, because also the rise of the kingdom of the Asturias was kind of something very progressive also in here. There were several principalities that were kind of autonomous. In fact, that's why the Christians also largely fought among themselves in this process, because even when here the problem was much greater, and this will be even particularly evident after even more evident after the mid-13th century with the victory of Las Navas, when basically the Muslims are now without a chance in the Iberian Peninsula, but it would take more than 200 years to take them out, simply because the Iberian Christian states would simply start killing themselves among each other, and they left just the Muslims in the south for quite a long time. So it's very meaningful that in this phase of Iberian history, the Christian powers would gravitate still around, as it had been in Visigothic time actually, for the kingdom, around this major councils, right? We have talked about the councils of Toledo and the institutional and political importance that they had in the Visigothic kingdom. Here, the city of Santiago becomes a sort of rally point, right, for all the Christians, and for stressing the sacrality also of their power, the legitimization of their power. Who could control these councils and be crowned in this city was objectively shown to be a powerful ruler, and that could take the lead even in broader of the broader Christian community in this sense. And it's very interesting because, as we said before, Al-Mansur takes the city. So you understand that, the Umayyads go take the holiest place in Spain, right? So the symbol of the same Christian identity in Iberia at this point. But Al-Mansur doesn't destroy the relics, right? He respected them. This was a way to show the greatness of Islam in front of the Christians, saying, we are so powerful, right, as Muslims, with our empire, with our great Cordoba and our caliphate mandate, that we destroy your holiest city, but we don't touch your Christian relics, because we don't even we don't even need to do that. There's no point with that. There's a great sense also of respect in a certain sense. This is not just about, because we don't consider nothing, as there's some, substantial part in common, even, in about Christianity. In Islam, there are several shared beliefs. So the Christians and Muslims always, for example, compared to the pagans, always treated each other kind of respectfully at the end of the day, because they recognized they were religions of the book. They came from that same background, that they shared much of some certain cultural origins of their own religion. So that there was this awareness and this tribute, this respect, right? What is interesting also is that before 997 destruction of the of Santiago, in 968 Santiago had been destroyed by the Normans, right? Because the Normans were, sailing around as usual at that point, and we land in Spain, we destroy Santiago, just for the record. By the way, I wanted to add relatively to this idea of the respect between Muslims and Christians. It wasn't really a matter of nicery, right? It was really a matter of of a political effect, of showing like this ultimate badass behavior. They could say, I even leave you your own relics, I don't care, right? But it goes without saying that, of course, if other churches were obviously razed to the ground, like Christians destroyed mosques if they could. I mean, this happened all the time. I mean, hell, the same Christians destroyed their own churches many times. So you can see in Carolingian capitularies that they say, when you approach the land, try to not to destroy, to set churches on fire and to commit rapes or something like that. In the Muslim world, I presume it was the same. Really about various Islamic powers that were one against the other and would destroy each other, even sacred places. But it was kind of normal, because soldiers do that regularly. They don't give a damn about these things, right? So when I present these struggles as, these sides respected each other, of course I say it always considering the standards of the time, because otherwise these times were continuously about extermination, rapes, enslavement, on a regular base, both from Christian and Muslim side, and I stress on a regular base, right, and on a completely homogeneous base, right. So let's not pretend that one side is better than others, or that it's a matter of really what you think, because humans are always humans and they do always the same things. They can't be as good or as bad as they could be. In this case, Al-Mansur was just very, very clever, right? But it was, as I was saying before, really a side effect that the Muslims did not expect, because this attack on Santiago de Compostella actually triggered a new phenomenon, right? For example, the same Vizier had launched this offensive because he had realized the importance of the resurgence of Christian power, right? They were noticing from the Muslims, and the Christians were reorganizing themselves. It was a slow process, right? took a lot of time before these Christian powers could really strengthen themselves around some kind of effective ruler that could have a certain military capability and strategic range of offensive, and managing to coordinate also with other powers, etc. So it was a slow process, but this here had at this point had reached sensible results. So that's why the Umayyads decide to strike back, to try to say let's cut it short, right? Instead, it kind of it kind of failed on the long run, because these were systemic processes that could kind of be reversed objectively, but this thing seemingly also backfired, right? The tomb of Saint James Apostle in Compostela was a very meaningful, very significant center for the Christians. And there had been this series of miracles occurred on the tomb. The sanctuary was calling year after year an ever larger number of pilgrims from regions that were not just within Spain, they were beyond the Pyrenees at this point. Were lots of people coming from France, from England, from Italy, from Germany. I mean, there was this idea now that this was becoming more than just a local center, right? The Spanish had kind of shaped it in this fashion for their own, let's say, evident local needs, right? Strengthening their gluing ideology and identity around the religious center, etc. But this was calling now for more, right? Europe was slowly recovering from this early medieval centuries. The Latin Germanic political and institutional structures were progressively taking shape, kind of a consistent form, and there was a lot of coordination in here. So what Al-Mansur probably underestimated at this point was that the cult of Saint James was from Compostela was now taking roots throughout all Europe. So the news of the profanation, the desecration of this sanctuary, right? That had eventually happened in the sense, the relics had not been touched, but the whole city was destroyed. So not really a very nice thing. It was a kind of a holy, or at least a symbolic city for its religious importance. Was not triggering fear or upset among the Christians. It wasn't at all dissatisfying the Christians, or making them forget that tradition. It was on the contrary the seed for indignation and enthusiasm to strike back to those who had that specific Christian center. It was a big thing, right? And you have to think what right in this, between the 10th and the 11th century, such symbolisms could mean, because they were at this point, really the symbols around which many new ideologies that were taking shape in Christian Europe were revolving around, right? It's the idea that the Christian identity was more than an uncoordinated local thing, like every region with its own tradition, its own saints, and nothing else. No, this was expanding. It had become, in fact, ecumenic throughout all, at least Western Christianity at this point. So, the cause of the apostle James became at this point the one of the entire Christianity, right? And more than this, right? We've seen there were pilgrims before, but more than pilgrims now, there was something else adding to it, and it was being associated to it the defense of the holy tomb threatened by the pagans, right? As the Christians also called the Muslims sometimes. The pilgrimage to the tomb of the apostle and the Reconquista were, in a certain sense, the two aspects of one single historical phenomenon. This is very important. Was this idea that at this point Christianity was starting in the West, especially, was starting to recognize itself in a more universal picture. I made a video, if I'm not wrong, about Sylvester II. It was actually about Rome, exactly into this specific years. That I can't find it, but it's surely in Medieval Christianity playlist. That dealt exactly with this. I mean, showing how in the years, in fact, of Pope Sylvester, the Christian culture was taking a shape that was reaching kind of a culturally universal level, and partly for the same cultural influences of Muslim Spain. This is particularly important. Same Sylvester II also there's all this area of Spain, but also southern France, for example, was massively influenced by Islamic culture and science and literature, and naturally Islam at this point was much more developed than Latin Germanic Europe from that point of view, and was emanating and spreading this new ideas of conceiving the world, this new awareness. Here I found the video that is the Roman Church and Gerbert of Aurillac, that deals exactly with this topic. It makes you understand how, even thanks to the Ottonian Empire, the Renovation Imperii, and this association between empire and papacy, there was a new universalistic language that now is taking over all over Christianity. This is very important, and it is a long process, because as we said at the beginning of the video, before the 8th, the 9th century, even the Carolingian Empire had a dramatic impact in this process, as we know. There was not quite of a perception of a unity of Christianity. Like, there was still the ideal one from a strictly ecumenical point of view, traditions of the various councils, etc., that came straight from the Roman Empire, but that now had kind of lost meanings. Like, what about the councils of the Byzantine Empire normally incorporated only the Byzantine controlled territories. Other churches, like the Visigothic one in Spain, the Frankish one in Gaul, the Roman one in Rome, the Longobarд one in northern Italy, even the Anglo-Saxon one, were developing with kind of their own characteristics. So it was important in many ways that, for example, a chunk of Christianity was eaten up in the West, in the Iberian Peninsula, in one shot, that the Carolingian Empire reformed around this. The Carolingians had even defeated the advance in Aquitaine of the Muslim armies at the Battle of Poitiers. This idea that now with the new Christian Empire in the West, with this imperial authority and the papacy associated to it, there was a real dialogue about a true universal direction. As we said before, the Ottonians also felt very much this role of communicating also a higher level of spheres of influences and diplomatic relations with not just with the Byzantine Empire, but the Umayyad Caliphate, that at this point had a tremendous impact on places like southern Gaul and then Tunisia and Sicily and then parts of southern Italy, and that at this point were really big problems, right? There was a strong connection by all the various, even trade interests and political and military operations in Europe and the Mediterranean, on the base of this big thing. So Al-Mansur was kind of still feeling, probably in a kind of a old-minded fashion, that the Muslims had the upper hand. Exactly in these years, around the year 1000, the tides were turning, right, slowly, because they were slowly turning, but they were. And as we will see now, in fact, the Umayyad Caliphate, however, crumbled. Almost all of a sudden, you could say that was the real big shot. It would be very interesting to know what would have happened if such events would have not taken place, but it even kind of doesn't make sense, because the premises for this disgregation had somewhat been already set. And it's very interesting because there are some sort of similarities at this point, in fact, that are shared between the same Latin Germanic Europe and these areas, these Muslim held areas, right? Where you find that there is a shared political fragmentation, but the difference is that while the Muslims were coming from kind of more centralized models, like statal ones, like the ones you could see in Spain, in Egypt, in Iraq, that crumbled. The Christians were doing slowly, much more slowly though, the opposite. Like, they were starting to build their own monarchies on a new feudal base, right? So there is a sort of reequilibration, especially in these years of the 11th century, where Islam is objectively in crisis, right? And the Christians can't take the upper hand, right? And that's where the crusade starts, incidentally, because there's a pretty widespread cultural, let's say, political collapse in the Islamic world that happens with the Seljuks. What do the Crusades start? The Crusades did not start exactly when the Seljuks arrive and take certain territories. They start happening kind of 20 years later, where the Seljuks are fragmenting. The same goes here with the Reconquista. The Reconquista starts when, or at least becomes, more evident, and there is a sensible Christian advance, where the Umayyads collapse, right? So these are important perspectives, because they're not at this point even just it was happening here and there, and everything was disconnected. It was starting being realized that it was a kind of let's say of a universal scale proportion, and there were certain authorities that were exploiting this. First of all, the Church of Rome was formulating, albeit slowly, its own reformation at this point, and that was perfectly understanding what kind of prestigious role the church could have, especially in connection with the empire and this political and military guidance that is expressed in the crusade, chiefly in the first crusade, because already from the second, the kings take over and the thing starts becoming something very different. I made a video quite recently about it, if you're interested in this passage. So it's something that also lasts, the papal control in the crusades lasts relatively few, and it transforms immediately something different. The title of the video is Evolution of Holy War, from the Call of God to the Regulated Crusade, 11th to the 13th century. So that partially explains, and also talks about, in fact, this phase of the Reconquista that is often forgotten, because it started providing the let's say the experimentation ground for organizing now true military enterprises. So the concept of armed pilgrimage now was being strengthened, so that the various pilgrims to Santiago de Compostella, now they weren't just pilgrims. There were now even knights and warriors, fighters, people who went there because they were kind of called, right? There isn't just a spiritual reason, right? Never underestimate the spiritual reasons in here, but always think that here it's always like it's been literally in every single time in world history, that wherever there is war, there are contractors that go finding a job, war is a job. It's always been like that, and it's normal. It's just like any other job, and these people go there. So the point is that obviously, usually at least, mostly were Christians, but never forget that these Christian armies, it was literally plenty of Muslims as well, just as much as in Muslim armies it was literally plenty of Christians all the time. So the thing was much blurred, and that's why at the very beginning of the video I said, we have to be cautious, because we get the perspective of the elites, because naturally the elites saw this new business, because it was really a business, right? Even pilgrimage and the crusades were a pretty big business. Think of all these knights that come there, and they kind of pay, they activate also kind of market of war, of production, armory production, and they open to new spaces. When they fight, they conquer new land where you can invest in. So it's from the elites that were directing this process from the top, where it's low. It was an enormous profit, and they were naturally pushing for it to accelerate and to develop, and that's where also let's say, these premises for the crusading ideologies start from. Also because the church from Rome starts saying, oh well, these guys are conquering now new land in the name of Christ. Now I want to control this, right? And I want to enhance, in fact, the possibility of directing these military forces, because directing these military forces means to be able to do it even in Europe, when you have a king that does not obey to me as a pope, and I can make his own vassals and knights to turn against him if he doesn't do what I tell him to do, which is what excommunication served to. You excommunicate a king, you automatically have like half of his kingdom against him, because he was full of other vassals who wanted obviously to take his own place and to aggrandize themselves, however, at least in the process. So this is to be read in this fashion, right? Not think this was was just about the Christians feeling offended because their sacred place was destroyed. Of course they did feel it, but this opened room and spaces for more, right? Because even spiritual resources, moral resources are important. You can't invest in it. It was an upsetting thing. Santiago de Compostella was not just a religious center, it was also a commercial trade center, like all religious centers are at the end of the day, right? Around churches, cathedral, it was a massive business, right? Just like around mosques, where you think, this is real stuff. And so I think this is a meaningful way of reading this phase. After the death of the Vizier Al-Mansur, or Al-Mansur is, in Spanish history is often remembered, the Caliphate of Cordoba collapsed. How did it happen? Well, we will have to dedicate a video to it, because it's a bit complicated to explain in a few words, but let's say that on the long run there are certain structures that deplete themselves at the point that they simply come, to tear them, to disappear, to stop. Like it's big, like the end of the Roman Empire. It was not a noisy crumble, like boom, the Roman Empire destroyed, mass. No, it was simply certain powers kind of autonomizing themselves, and the play not playable anymore, right? So in a certain way, of course, there had been a previous, there were the problems, there was a crisis in the Caliphate. That was based, in fact, on the rise of importance of these various local principalities, the so-called reinos de Taifas in Spanish, which practically means exactly this: these small kingdoms that into which this quite big, geographically speaking, caliphate was about. The Iberian Peninsula, I think, if I'm not wrong, I think France is the largest state in Europe, but I think that the Iberian Peninsula as a whole is larger, right? So at this point there is not distinction between Spain and Portugal, so it's a massive chunk of Europe at this point. It gets the splits into this series of principalities that at this point start becoming very permeable, right? They're not just weaker individually, so you can't kind of play on them either, but you can also turn them against each other. You can bribe them more easily, and that's where the thing gets even more complicated to tell from a political and religious point of view, because at the end of the day, as long as the big Umayyad Caliphate existed, you knew, well, at least from that side it's Muslim, right? There is this big power, we know it can attack, there is this deterrent factor that even holds the Christians back legitimately. At this point there is nothing like that. There is like a broad mess to kind of make sense of, and to reorder with this thing. And so naturally there had been also internal infight. There were several years of internal clashes, after which the caliphate was abolished fundamentally in 1031. So it was a couple of decades essentially, and this Reinos de Taifas emerged, right? There were several conflicts, by the way, before we several layers, let's say, of conflict. Before we remember the fact that, for example, the big state one is in the south, and this kind of smaller principalities already existed in the north, from the Muslim side. There were also kind of differences between the certain parties within the caliphal power, let's say within the Cordoban power. Like there were families of namely Arab ancestry, were opposed to the one of Berber ones coming from North Africa. Naturally, many of these powers were largely Iberian now in de facto, right? They had long mixed with the local populations, but this idea of descending from the old line of conquerors or being this other factions that came from North Africa, it was a big deal of internal political dialectic even within Islam. And that Western Islam has always been peculiar here, because naturally there was this allegedly say this Arabicized elite, let's call it better, because many people presume that the Arabs, when we talk about the Arab invasions, the Islamic armies that invaded places like Spain or southern Italy were things like they were Arab, right? The Arabs were just a bunch of among the leaders. The overwhelming numbers were people collected around the way. So in this case, Berbers largely, but there were also many Christians among themselves. I mean, it's notorious at this point, universally known, that many Saracens were actually Christians. So the concept here is that there is an internal dialectic that will be reinvigorated between the fresher strengths of certain Islamic powers. This will be more evident later with the Almohads and the Almoravids. That in Spain have this impact is that these populations, Berber populations from the Atlas in northwestern Africa, they start because they're kind of tribal powers. They're more warlike, so they have this immediate energies and strengths to spend. They see a lot of political turmoil, so that's the best opportunity in any historical context. What's better than invading one place that is politically divided and rich, like post-Umayyad Spain was at this point. So there were these waves coming from North Africa that kind of got in Spain once again, and naturally who was already there from the Muslim side was not very happy, because these were populations now had coexisted, that had existed in the first place as kind of properly Iberian powers for centuries, right? And these newcomers weren't obviously very liked, and all these clashes and coup brought to further weakening of the centralized structures, so that at the end of the day, even the Almoravids and the Almohads, as long as they arrive, as soon as they arrive, actually they are kind of powerful, but then they immediately also fragment themselves. So after the Umayyads, it was never quite a real big state, right? There were just these powers that kind of refueled the even the jihad in itself, but it wasn't much, quite of a big deal, and it was always about really seizing the south. Nobody really cared about the north, and at that point the Christians in the north had already become too powerful, so there wasn't much that could be done, because there was not anymore the big state that could launch the massive offensives and subdue everyone, at least nominally. At this point it was really kind of a feudal, kind of quasi-feudal situation, even from the Muslim side. So this situation remained for a certain time in a state of unstable balance, because also the Christian kingdoms in the north were naturally characterized by internal rivalries and enmity, right? At this point, as we were saying before, Christians were killing themselves among each other as much as Muslims were killing themselves among each other, and obviously was plenty of Christians would join with certain Muslims, and plenty of Muslims would join with certain Christians, and it's really normality in this frontier environment. Things changed, however, with the finally joined Castilian / Leonese and Aragonese offensive that led to the conquest of the Douro Valley and of the city of Coimbra in Portugal, and also to the enterprise of Barbastre in Aragon in 1164. Maybe we'll talk about this stuff on another occasion. After this, and here this exemplifies a little bit both the change and also the mixed context that we were talking about, of the history of the Cid de Campeador, right? So it was a very important figure that frames itself in this context. Basically, the King of Castile, Alfonso VI, led, also with the help of this legendary warrior, Rodrigo Diaz de Bivar, called it the Cid Campeador, to the conquest of Toledo. Right, it was quite a big deal, because Toledo was the ancient Visigothic capital. It's like in the perfect center of the Iberian Peninsula. It's a symbol city, right, and it's also very solid center, and that would become effectively the capital of Castile, right? Castile is basically Castilla y León, right? In Spanish, because it started from León. It was in turn before the Asturias kingdom, but Toledo is more powerful, so the center of Castile starts is shifted in here then, and the conquest happened on May the 6th, 1085. Now Toledo was one of the Muslim Toledo was one of the greatest, most beautiful and cultured cities of the time in Europe. It's like, this was a spring of culture, of education. Muslim Spain, as we were saying before, was many Christians wasn't there just to seize manuscripts, to learn new stuff. It was very, very, very important. Very, very important. It would become even later, in fact, even thanks to this Muslim influence that kept existing, and one of the most important centers of translation, right, for all the books that came from the Islamic world that was at the vanguard at this point were translated in there. The Arab, from Jewish, naturally into Latin. Everything passed through Spain, right? So Spain was this kind of enormous distributor of culture at this point, thanks to what the Islamic civilization had been. Now the Christians seize it, so it also here the thing gets switched. And what is interesting in here that the Christian conquest of Toledo was also possible thanks to the support of the Moorish Malik of Badajoz, right? Because in Badajoz, there was another Muslim center. They didn't quite like Toledo as well. The Malik of Badajoz was Al-Qadir, right? And Alfonso VI had basically promised to Al-Qadir the city of Valencia as a compensation for the military support that would provide for destroying Toledo. Instead, Al-Qadir was assassinated, and this triggered the fury of Cid de Campeador. Now we will describe a bit better, because he was friend with the Saracen, right? And he wanted also for his personal gain to take revenge of this killing against Alfonso VI, who he accused of having betrayed the given word and this brought to the famous siege of Valencia that lasted for 20 years at the end of El Cid, that fell eventually on June the 15th of 1094. So that El Cid became the Lord of Valencia, and he eventually reconciled himself with Alfonso VI, and he maintained Valencia up to 1099. The year of his death, that is also incidentally the year of the conquest of Jerusalem by the Crusaders in the Near East. This is important because it's very symbolic, I presume that in Spanish historiography this year is loaded with many meanings. This perspective, this idea that objectively from the Iberian side the Reconquista had already somewhat started before in fact the Crusades would be launched from the other areas of Western Europe. And it's the age of many changes, right? In perspective. So, talking about El Cid, it would be a lot to tell about him. So first of all, this nickname, Cid, in fact it's spelled C-I-D, and pronounced Cid, and under this name, because I don't think there is, at least I don't remember. I think the term comes from Arab Sayyid, which means Lord, right? In fact, in the same Arab, often the term Sayyid is contracted in Cid, like S-I-D. But this is the nickname that, in fact, so the Lord. Always remember in here that there are strong analogies even between Christian and Muslim chivalric cultures that in Spain especially are radically blended. Right, we were talking about that also in that video we made on the Al-Andalus. Let me look. That it was about the Umayyad infantry. Yeah, Andalusian infantry, 8th to 11th century. And there I was pointing that out because in that video we analyzed the equipment of of the Andalusian infantry, of the Umayyad infantry in the centuries, and it turns out that was strikingly similar to the Christian one in many ways, because the Iberian Peninsula is a bit isolated in itself, so there are certain things that blend into it from the Christian and Muslim sides. In fact, in this sense, doesn't even make sense to try to distinguish in terms of material culture, for example, more than much at least. Yeah, it's true, like northern Spain is a bit more influenced by Frankish military culture, and southern Spain is a bit more influenced by like North African or even Eastern, like even up to Middle Eastern culture. There are certain things in Spain that recall a lot, like certain Persian armor, for example, and that reflects naturally the long-ranging ties and relations that existed also still at this point in the Muslim world. So the idea of chivalry is shared in the West. Now we've made many videos on Western chivalry. We'll keep doing them. In the Islamic world, it's a bit more like this idea of youth, right? It's very harmonized, and it's very shared. Like there are many things that are shared between Christian and Islamic idea of chivalry, right? And in Spain, this is particularly evident. So also in here, Spain predates a lot of stuff. In the Near East, when the Crusaders arrived, and they realized that they're fighting against the Turks that were highly Persified and therefore loaded with this notoriously chivalric and feudal culture of Iran, they recognize in some of them, in the Seljuk elites, something about chivalry on their own, and that's what partly that sort of respect stemmed I was talking to you about before, because obviously they hated each other guts. But aside from the fact that even in there, we made several videos about that, showing how many Christians in the Near East fought for the Muslims and how many Muslims fought for the Christians, and they, in spite of hating their guts and killing each other and raping and slaughtering and massacring each other all the time, they also respected each other, because they respected this shared lifestyle, military lifestyle of the knights, of the mounted fighter. It was a big deal throughout all the world at this point. Like chivalric culture, the equestrian military style, something that really unites many civilizations, where they can reflect themselves into very, very easily. So the name of the El Cid, so the Lord, was this Castilian Rui or Rodrigo Diaz of Bivar, was this legendary hero, right? Even if he was an actual historical figure, it's more like of a hero objectively of the Spanish reconquest over the Arabs. Naturally, just like other figures in history, like William Wallace for the Scots, etc., there is this all kind of national ideal gravitating around him, but the reality was much grimmer, in the sense that when we talk about these figures, we're talking about more than knights, about murderers. Let's be totally honest about this stuff. We're talking about 11th century Europe. There is not much to add to that. Naturally, chivalric culture, also religiously loaded, was depicting these as the great religious fighters. But you have to contextualize these works, these perceptions in that world that naturally produced such ideas. And as always, as we were saying, it's the elites that produce these ideas. So the elites has all the interest to adorn and to magnify certain figures that were formerly very simpler. But this doesn't mean we're talking about great military leaders, right? This constant frontier warfare, what you have, it's this dramatically skilled knights that fight either for the Christians or the Muslims, depending on who pays them better. It has nothing to do with their religion at the end of the day, even if they believe into it evenly. It's always been like this, that if there is a convenience, things happen in spite of what people truly believe, right? So this is particularly important also to see in perspective. And El Cid is documented, in fact, by several sources in in Latin Spain, also certain Arab narrative sources of the time. So all these sources confirm the historical existence of the El Cid, and I don't think that it's so easy, right? 11th century Europe, history is not a thing that says, this guy was mentioned, so it was true. Like, you have always to contextualize the source and to understand what they meant, understand who these people were. Do you think we know, who people really were like in the 11th century? How do you think history is? That we factually know with this stuff, it's very complicated, it's dramatically complicated from an historical, philological, cultural point of view. We always have to take everything with caution. These are highly stylized and ideologically oriented sources, that there is always a bigger narrative that you have to understand before thinking that they're actually telling the truth, right? But this tradition obviously started from a real person, from a real character. So Rodrigo, as we said before, had served Castile. First, actually under Sancho II, that we mentioned before, also the crownings in Santiago de Compostella. Sancho II of Castile in the war against his own brother Alfonso VI of Leon. So here we see that even Castile and Leon are fighting, two Christian powers fighting each other. And El Cid had given Sancho the victory of Golpellares, where seemingly El Cid obtained his further nickname of Campeador, which means kind of like fighter, warrior. Like here, the etymology is of the be of camper, like either not in the video gaming sense of the word, meaning that he fought on the camp in the battlefield, right? So this man would belong to the battlefield, right? This fighter, and these were naturally professional fighters. When we talk about 11th century knights, we're thinking about now the concept of the miles, right? As very well developed already. We're talking about a true and solid, heavily armored cavalry that spans literally their own entire lives to fight, right? This is the miles as a professional fighter in a nutshell, because fighting was, first of all, a huge investment. Think about the war horse and the equipment and all this. It was like having a private jet to have, a war horse and an armor, etc. So you had, this costed a freaking amount of money. So you had necessarily to fight, because fighting was the best way to earn more. Okay, it was risky, but the bet was higher, and naturally, if you won, at least you could compensate the expenses. So the life of these people was astonishingly violent, brutal, and short, usually. So it was pure violence to the essence, right, of these figures, like their pride, their authority, their honor, and their success as businessmen of war was entirely rooted on this, right? Like killing, effectively. In fact, El Cid takes his name of Campeador because he allegedly defeated in duel a Navarrese knight in this war. So here you see Leon, Castile, and Navarre, all Christian powers that are fighting each other. So very, very nicely. And Sancho II of Castile died at the siege of Zamora, where he was assassinated, just in terms of shortness of life, and not just for natural causes, as he was effectively killed by his sister Urraca and her brother, their brother, that at the time was at Toledo. And Rodrigo at this point obliged the successor Alfonso to this terrible oath of innocence, of which it seems that he was very angered by it at the end of the day because he had been obliged to do so. So for certain intrigues and plots and courtesans, and also for having seized certain gifts that had been sent by the King of Granada, that had been defeated by him, and that had sent instead gifts to King Alfonso. Alfonso exiled the Cid de Campeador, right? And this is interesting because it already tells you even how much this military professionals had risen in importance, and sometimes this was still a somewhat heroic state of matters. Like, at this point monarchies were not that strong, right? These powers were somewhat considerable, of course, but sometimes really the victory in certain battles depended on the presence of figures like El Cid, right, and his retinues. Presumably there was some big deal of mercenarism involved, but even the individual prowess and intelligence and even just the charisma that such knights could have was very important, because at this point armies were also fairly small, so even a single knight kind of could could distinguish himself more easily and making his fortune because of it. So it's very interesting that the King of Granada was defeated by El Cid, and that the king decided to send gifts like friendship of pacification to, not to him, but to a true king like Alfonso was. So the Cid obviously is a very proud person. He doesn't accept this, and he seizes these gifts by himself because they said, I defeated you, so you pay tribute to me, not to the king. So because of this, the Cid gets banished by Alfonso of Castile, and that's where, even according to the legend, the real achievements and deeds of the warrior began, because he was obviously already a very accomplished fighter, but he started this new errant life that brought him to the enseignurement of Saragossa, not of a kind of a small center, right? Kind of a considerable one instead. And after some years, as we've seen, of Valencia in 1094. So at this point, seizing two cities like Saragossa and Valencia were a pretty big deal, right? And at this point, Alfonso was at the acme of his power, and he said himself that if Rodrigo had lost Spain, given it to the Muslims, another Rodrigo would have taken it back. Now, what did this mean? Well, obviously this means that obviously this is all legend, right? These are phrases that appear from the chronicles of the deeds, but it simply means that, first of all, it shows you how, like, in between the Christians and the Muslims the Cid was, because the Cid fought for many Muslim rulers as well, making his fortune in that way. But in this sense, he was basically the one who basically maintained the balance of forces even between these two sides, roughly, distinguished, so that it was Rodrigo's will to decide whether one side would prevail or the other. So this wanted to highlight, whether it's true or not, but the greatness of this man, which was objectively true, because the power, of this man, because of the land that he had seized and the power that he effectively owned, right? And however, in 1099, as we've seen, he died of pain after a defeat, and so his widow, Donna Jimena, couldn't maintain the Signory of Valencia. At this point, also because she was actually Alfonso VI's cousin. So the Cid had married into royalty as well. This gives you the level of its own prestige. So the Cid body was transported to the monastery of St. Peter of Cardenha and there buried. This is a place not far from Burgos, where he had almost a saint-like cult, right? And therefore there is this legend. Now we could talk endlessly about Cid de Campeador, of all the importance also in literature. Maybe one day we will do, and we don't have to be surprised, however, by the fact that during his military adventures, with this military retinue he had, as all the lords of the time, he assaulted, for example, Arab castles, but also put himself at the service of Arab princes that were fighting among each other. And simply because this was regularly done by the other Castilian nobles themselves, right? You can imagine in this sense what kind of, can we really talk even about a clash between Christians and Muslims? Evidently it starts. And definitely though, and this is what probably is more difficult to understand for us, is that in spite of all, these people had their own faith. I mean, Cid was a Christian and he probably felt it very deeply, right? So there is nothing incongruent given the context, given the lifestyle, given the necessities, the opportunities, the how really the world was going in those places, and this is what also made of him this kind of heroic and legendary and romantic figure that is so famous and celebrated. And there is all a history of literature of the Cid that also developed later in time, actually. Somewhat, I don't know about the sources, but there's surely the Chronica General of Alfonso the Tenth, that has been written much later. Then there is naturally the Cantar de Mio Cid, that is 3,735 verses, the most famous work composed in El Cid's glory. There are naturally all the romances that started in the 15th century about him. So maybe one day we will talk about them, but for now I think that this was the most important picture to draw in essential lines. So you realize that let's say the fluidity of this scenario, the big thing, like even the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate, of this enormous power that had represented, a point of reference, even as an enemy for the Christians, and even this local levels of development, from the various monarchical constructions to the rise of very important religious centers like Santiago as kind of a national symbols, this broader Western Christian influence in reviving the Reconquista feeling and experimenting the Crusades, the armed pilgrimage, and this natural world of opportunities, of business, of war, of radically violent to the core, but also kind of based in fact on political intelligence as always, and rivalries and infights among the same co-religionaries that were, at the order of the day at the time. There is in this broader perspective, I think an interesting, if you hear these stories for the first time, you may want to look at them in a kind of progressivistic ideal, like, the idea, for example, the Reconquista had to go on. The Reconquista is a concept that has been built over time, that has taken several different directions. It developed, it was structured, was idealized. We have seen that it effectively lasted 800 years or 500 years, depending on when you want to make it start. but it's a change in this high Middle Ages at so many levels, right? Think at what, for example, the presence of the Umayyad Caliphate had meant from the 8th to the 11th century, as we've seen. I mean, it's a very long time. Like when you in a country that is relatively enclosed on its own, like the Iberian Peninsula in part was, especially for those who were confined in the north. Also, to think about the communication difficulties with the mountains, the Pyrenees, this large and evident and unavoidable geographical border. You kind of start developing certain paradigms, certain views of the world, like the idea that even the frontier, there is someone from this side and someone from the other side. There's a lot of opportunities in the middle, a lot of chameleon-like world in the middle, where there are Christians and Muslims coexisting, fighting or working together, and you having to make sense of this and to regulate the relation with the elites, and kind of struggling in trying to maintain your autonomy at the same time trying to expand it on someone else. Think even about, in fact, I think the most impacting event in here was really the collapse of the Caliphate of Cordoba, which happened fairly quickly by certain standards, and how this changed everything. It changed the opportunity of going out there and seizing new land and fighting against enemies that now are much softer, much more divided, so much more easy to exploit in many ways. And that's what really changes a lot. It's like a bit, the disgregation of Carolingian Empire for the Scandinavians and the start of the Viking era, or in fact the collapse of the Seljuk power, the fragmentation of Seljuk power in the beginning of the Crusades. Many stuff, and this is, I think, an interesting key of interpretation. I mean, the idea that when there is a big power that crumbles, there is another era that begins, and it's an era that, however, has to be defined. It's not like specularly reflected, like there is one power that crumbles, there is immediately one other power that emerges, that is its equivalent from the other side. No. Well, it would take a lot of time, more centuries, for the Christians to reach certain comparable levels of development, chiefly the kingdom of Castile and Leon. But also in there, the balance was always kind of pretty unstable, and everything was pretty damn complicated. But at the same time, it's from this complication, from this contrast, from this conflict that as I often say, civilization develops, right? It's this ability of understanding finally so much, of really starting to understand your enemy more, or maybe making a new one, or depicting a new one, or starting telling certain histories. Even historiographically speaking, this Iberian kings now start to write a history on their own. It's very meaningful, because a lot of what we know about those worlds are thanks to these chronicles. So that's a way of, it's a perspective that is presented. It's an idea. It's a world that we can see through those people's eyes. And never forget that we do it through that optical mean, right? You can't exclude that. You can't pretend it doesn't matter. It does matter, and that's even as such figures like Cid de Campeador were developed in folklore, etc. Reality was much less resounding in a certain sense, but in others actually was way more resounding, probably at the time. And it's very complicated to get this middle, because we need to put it automatically on a kind of a same dimension, but there were multiple dimensions at once, right? So we will naturally come back on these topics, and as you know, which Schwerpunkt now we do just very tiny bits of these histories at a time, at least for what tiny this hours long videos can mean, but eventually and hopefully one day going a bit deeper into this stuff and starting to tell these histories step by step a bit more precisely. So anyhow, I hope that for now you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.